Alright, Shalom. First and foremost of all praise, honor, and glory to the Heavenly Father and His only begotten Son, Yahweh, Bahashem, Yahweh Shai, Bahashem, Merkah HaKodash, Double Say Apostles, and other bishops, great millstone, teaching us from saying truth according to the Bible, and rule well, in peace and blessings, so elected the nation of Israel, take their spirit and power of Yahweh Shema Shai, willing and told Lord's willing and edifying lesson. Today, lesson we're going to hop into the scriptures here in St. Luke chapter 12, verse 31. It says, "But rather seek ye the kingdom of the Most High, and all these things shall be added unto you." So rather than, worrying about, how we're going to eat and drink and, take care of ourselves in this side, our main priority is, keeping the main thing the main thing. The things that come with the worldly affairs try to draw you away so you can put more time and energy into these things. Now, these aren't, a reason for us to neglect our responsibilities here on this side, but we should be putting our main energy and focus in getting to know Yahweh Shema Shai more, right? And us getting to know Yahweh Shema Shai, and us understanding that nothing is too hard for the Lord. Whatever situations that we're going through, the Lord can easily get us out of these situations. The Lord is actually in control of the situations that we're going through, right? And these things are all just tests to see whether or not we're going to continue to be diligent and, praying to Him, right? Being consistent in prayer, being consistent in our reading, in our studies, being in your mind, full of hope, with the expectation that, Yahweh Shema Shai is able to, really do anything. We have to believe that, especially coming into a time, especially coming into times that we've never experienced, no food on the grocery stores, lockdowns, restrictions of your travel, persecution of the church. These are things that are, fastly approaching. So this, as we get closer and closer to the kingdom of Yahweh Shema Shai, the path becomes narrow, but the light shines brighter and brighter. Yahweh Shai being that light, we're seeing the signs of His return. We're getting ready to enter into immortality, everlasting life. But real quick, this is 1 Corinthians 10 and 13. "There have no temptation taken you, but such as is common to man." What we're going through, here it is. We're in Babylon the Great. everyone's going through what we're going through, in the sense of, bills may be tight. Our you got to deal with the stress, of ignorant people at the job. Just simple things that we deal with while we're, bearing our cross. We're still full of hope. "I believe, therefore have I spoken," right? So the fact that we're, brothers are constantly doing these lessons, is proof that we believe that this is not the end all be all. This is not the place where we, die, so to speak. The people here are dead. They're making videos, the same things that we're going through, they're going through, but they're making videos crashing out on the internet, while we're saying that, things could get worse and things are going to get worse, but we have an expectation, aka a hope, a lively hope, that Yahweh Shema Shai is going to lift up a standard for us, and is lifting up a standard for us, in these times already. Brothers, are giving testimony, brothers are seeing, neighbors are moving out, but yet you're still there. Yahweh Shema Shai still has food. Brothers still got gas in their tank, to get back and forth to work. It's, really just appreciating the small things that we do have, as this kingdom is circling the drain. I was just did a post on my channel, all the mass layoffs, people are going through. So people are really feeling it. People are extremely stressed out, by what's going on in the world, and we have, hope to, call upon the name of Yahweh Shema Shai for, the Lord's mercy. It says, there have no temptation taken you, but such as is common to man. But the Most High is faithful, who would not suffer you to be tempted above that ye are able. See, the Most High is very faithful. The Most High knows our strengths, our weaknesses, and the things that we're going through. Of course, they're, meant for us to maximize our strengths, but also our weaknesses are being, straightened, are being, turned into strengths as well. You start to realize, what the Heavenly Father wants us to learn, in these different situations that we go through, right? It says, who will not suffer ye to be tempted above that ye are able, but will with the temptation also make a way to escape, that you may be able to bear it, right? So the things that we're going through aren't meant to destroy us, aren't meant to, take us out of the faith. No, they're meant to, actually draw us closer to Yahweh Shema Shai. It's actually supposed to have us to trust in the Lord more and to rely more on His power, more on His ability to deliver us out of any situation. As we jump back here in St. Luke chapter 12, verse 32 says, fear not, little flock, for it is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom, right? So we have, we shouldn't be in the spirit of fear and worrying. The Heavenly Father wants to give us a kingdom. How much a kingdom, dominion, rulership over the earth. The Heavenly Father wants to give, you an inheritance, joint heirs with Yahweh Shai. And this is where our faith lies. This is what we believe. To get new bodies. These bodies are, completely through at the end of the day. Everybody's dealing with their own personal hell in these bodies, where it be constant ailments, headaches, or, burning in the flesh. It's this, that, and the third. It's just we're constantly going through the ups and downs of, this flesh and, being here in the society, right? But here it is, 2026, the hopeful year. The year of, sellouts, Asians, apostates, and, Jacob's trouble, right? And we're seeing people sell out. We're seeing people deny the name of the Lord, and we still have the name of the Lord. See, the name of the Lord is a strong tower. The righteous runneth into it and is safe. And we're running to that name, now more than ever, right? Should find ourselves praying more to the Lord, meditating, upon, lessons that Yahweh Shema Shai wants us to learn. And when you jump here to St. John 14:1, it says, let not your heart be troubled. Ye believe in the Most High, believe also in me. Right? And Yahweh Shai was there with His disciples, speaking to them, letting them know, letting them know, the will of the Lord. We're receiving and understanding what the will of the Lord is. See, this is the gospel, the good news. This is good news for us. As we receive this, this word, this word is a two-edged sword. You have to be careful how you wield, this sword, because, you can get cut. And if you're not careful, wielding a two-edged sword, you can actually die, so if we're not careful, right, we're not, cursed be the man that doeth the work of the Lord deceitfully, and that holdeth back his sword from blood. So we can't, be in this thing for filthy lucre's sake. We're here to work out our own salvation with fear and trembling. We're here to serve the Lord in all sincerity and truth, because we want to make it, out of America, make it out of Babylon the Great. We have no desire to really be here in this kingdom, and we're crying out to the Lord daily to come back and deliver us out of this place, and to save us, out of the land of our captivity. It says, let not your heart be troubled, so no matter what you're going through, you can't be troubled in the mind. In the midst of the storm, you have to be calm while the storm is going. while the waves are roaring, while the clouds are, pouring down heavy. You have to be calm in the midst of that storm and know that eventually it will subside. Right? It will subside. It will, the Lord's mercy, is it's gonna show itself. And then you go on to your next test, then you go into your next battle. And you take what you learned from the previous battle, right? And you keep it pushing. We're not going to be perfect on this side. We're not going to be, we're not going to get everything right. We're going to make mistakes. We're going to fall short. But that's where the Lord's mercy lies. We get up, we dust ourselves off, and we, continue to try again. It says, in my Father's house are many mansions, right? The mansions are the different planets. See, the Heavenly Father has many planets being prepared for us right now as He sees us working. We don't, we may not, dang, all this work isn't for nothing. The apostles and elder bishops been laboring for decades now, still catching hell, still going through different ailments and different things, diseases in the body, catching a holy hell, right? Bearing the cross of Yahweh Shai, and everything that we're going through, as a body is not for nothing. In my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you, I go to prepare a place for you. So Yahweh Shai is preparing a place for us. Yahweh Shai is preparing, each, more than likely, each brother is going to have their own planet to rule over. Dominion, here upon the earth. Even us having dominion upon the earth, as the government body of Yahweh Shai, the earth, think how massive the earth is. Which I speak as, I believe the earth is way bigger than, Esau, Edom has, mapped out, far bigger than that. This is the Heavenly Father, we're speaking about here, far out. I don't think they, that's just me speaking as a man. But anyways, it says, in my Father's house are many mansions, right? If it were not so, I would have told you, I go to prepare a place for you. And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again. This is Red Letter speaking. This is Yahweh. Do you think Yahweh Shai is a liar? Or do you believe what Yahweh Shai said, that He said He was coming back? We see the prophecies coming to pass. We see the will of the Lord being done. Clearly, the Lord is going to come back for us and save us out of this place. We just have to keep hope alive. Constantly being reminded daily of the promise of Yahweh Shai's coming. And as you watch the prophecies, you see things, moving into a digital currency. And really, it's going to happen really like all of a sudden. Just like all of a sudden we're in the proxy war. Well, next, it's not a proxy war. We're in the real war now. I mean, America is actually in the war, with, Iran, Russia, is helping, Iran. So is China, so, we're, we're seeing these things. We're seeing and hearing rumors of how the supply chain, with the straits being closed, is about to cause prices to rise. We understand when it comes to, I'm pretty sure I mentioned the mass layoffs that are going on, that are very present amongst these tech jobs because AI is quote unquote taking the jobs. And really, those are just excuses to, to cut back and budget, so they can keep, investing in the NWO system, and you useless eaters, they no longer need you. You see, what the Heavenly Father is not going to do is cast away, those who are laboring in the faith, sincerity and truth. The Lord isn't just going to hire us on for a project just to cast us away. No, the Lord, is getting ready to give those who trust in him a great reward. It says, and if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you unto myself, that where I am, there ye may be also. So this is what Yahushua promised us, right? And, it's ultimately, once again, do you believe the promise, right? And, here in St. Matthew chapter 19, verse 27, then answered Peter and said unto him, Behold, we have forsaken all and followed thee. What shall we have therefore? Yeah, and brothers have forsaken all. You think about the time and, and dedication that we put into the truth. The fact that we go, and teach on the weekends. We work a little 9-to-5 job. On the weekends, of course, some people party, but then you have some people who are, quote unquote entrepreneurs, and they work on the weekends towards their side hustle, their businesses, securing, stability for their families. So we have sacrificed a lot, in the sense of, rejecting, this world. We rejected this world. We rejected, spending times with our loved ones, and especially on the weekends. All the cookouts are always on Saturday. All the family gatherings are on the weekends. The times that you could spend extra with your little ones, with your seeds. All that, with your woman. We've forsaken all of those things to put in time and energy. Yeah, you could, brothers, brothers, we, starting with the apostles and elders, they don't take days off. So you could literally, see how many weeks are in the year, right? And then 52 weeks in the year, and then you calculate how many, decades they've been in the truth. That's how, think about all those hours out there on the highways and hedges. And the apostles gave the account where the main camp, they used to be out there for, 8, 9, 10 hours plus. Still got camps going out for, multiple hours throughout the week. Multiple hours, multiple work being put in. So brothers have forsaken all. Brothers have forsaken, this world and all of its, quote unquote pleasure, just as Yahushua denied this world. We are denying it here in the present time. And Yahushua said unto them, Verily I say unto you, that ye which have followed me in the regeneration, when the Son of Man shall sit in the throne of his glory, ye also shall sit upon 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. Right, so we're gonna be put into a position of a leadership position amongst the house of Israel, and everyone that forsaken houses, our brethren, our sisters, our father, our mother, our wife, our children, our lands, for my name's sake. Right, I believe another version says, yea, in his own life also. Right, it says, for my name's sake shall receive 100-fold, and shall inherit everlasting life. And I made this point, in my last lesson. If you live forever, you really can't fathom what type of thing you will experience living forever. You can't fathom it. You can't imagine the different experiences. You can't even imagine. I mean, the average experience here in America is so low level. You make some money, you travel, you go to different places, you try different foods. Maybe you get with some women here and there. And that's really it. We're going to really live, and, understand, how the elements work, and, the different, understand how, things are made. We're actually going to build things as well, we're gonna build, and we're gonna forward righteousness in the earth. We're gonna live forever. You can't fathom that, So we're gonna receive 100-fold. We're gonna receive everything that we lost here, and then some, right here in Hebrews chapter 6, verse 10. It says, "For the Most High is not unrighteous to forget your work and labor of love, which ye have showed towards his name, in which ye have ministered to the saints and do minister." Right? So the Most High is not unrighteous to forget our works and our labor of love. Us serving, rain, sleet, snow, brothers doing lessons when they're tired, when they're under the weather, making sure, showing up to class, all these things, all these sacrifices that you're making, and, your loved ones. Why are you doing these things? Well, why are you doing these things? And we're doing them because we want to serve Yahweh by Shema Shai. We have a zeal to serve our power, right? And we want to, make it out of here. We're working out our salvation in fear and trembling. We got to always remember that Yahweh Shai was a man who walked the earth, and who was obedient, to the cross, right? And we must be obedient, in hopes that we receive, those glorious bodies that he received. 1 John 3:1, "Behold, what manner of love the Father hath bestowed upon us, that we should be called the sons of God." See, we're the sons of God. Really, we're the top nation on earth. We're just going through our punishment. This is just a punishment. And when you compare it with immortality, this is just a drop in the bucket. Scriptures say, who can number the scriptures talk about how 1,000 years is 1,000 years is not to be compared with eternity. 1,000 years is not even meant to be compared with eternity. So we're gonna live forever. So what manner of love had the Father bestowed upon us, that we're Israelites, talking to the brothers, and we're men, we're Israelite men, and, whatever lot you may be in, whether you be a prophet or a believer, it's a beautiful thing regardless. But we know the 144,000, that office, it's special. And so is the great multitude, right? To be part of the Lord's body, to be part of the Lord's elect. That's the top, that's the remnant of the nation of Israel who has the sand of the sea. You see, it says, "Therefore the world knoweth us not, because it knew him not." And that's a good thing. We don't want to be recognizable. We don't want to be friends with this world. This world rejected Yahweh Shai. So it's an honor that this world rejects us. We're not, this isn't a popularity contest. The Lord is gathering his elect, and we're gonna see, how Yahweh Shema Shai lifts up his elect, here in these last days. It says, "Behold, now we are the sons of God, and it doth not yet appear what we shall be." We work the same jobs as these people, ride the same bus, back and forth to work as these people, shop at the same grocery stores. We're part of this society, but it does not yet appear, what we shall be. God's on the earth, judges on the earth, kings on the earth. A king has, control over resources, and, people serve him. This is gonna, this is what we're fighting for. This is what we're hoping to be a part of. The elect of Yahweh by Shema Shai, and they have a saying, pain is temporary, but greatness lasts forever, so, the greatness, glory is forever, that's the beautiful thing about it. We still are hearing about the glory of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and how they maintain their integrity. We're still hearing about the glory, of King David, and, Daniel and the lions. And, those were glorious, accounts that our forefathers, those were glorious acts to our forefathers, how they maintained their integrity, trusting in Yahweh Shema Shai. Same thing for us, Lord's willing, on this side. It says, Beloved, now are we the sons of God, and does not yet appear what we shall be, but we know that when he shall appear, we shall be like him, for we shall see him as he is. And every man that have this hope in himself, purifieth himself, even as he is pure. So if you believe this, if you believe that, we're going to receive those new bodies, you're going to purify yourself. You're going to be washed. You're going to meditate upon, your imperfections. You're going to meditate upon, where you can get better, where your weaknesses are. That's the point of sparring in the battle, right? So you can see, okay, well, I'm lacking here. I do this good. Right? It's not always about what you do good. It's about, where you're lacking and where you can improve. And then when you improve in that area, it makes the other areas strong as well. You got the my player character for NBA, which I never had the patience to play that. But you can't just have him shooting threes 24/7. No, you gotta get his handles up, and whatever else that comes with that, So you gotta get your your wits about you, So and it's a process, it's not overnight, So we gotta take full advantage of this grace period as we're coming to a time like none other, and the time is short. So understanding that time is short, we want to get, make full advantage of this grace period, getting stronger day by day, constantly praying to Yahweh Shema Shai, constantly getting to know the Lord better, and learning to be still in the midst of all the chaos that's going on, in our day-to-day lives, as all hell's getting ready to break loose in this world. So with that, I pray the edify through